Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to episode 16 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. On this week's episode, AJ and I give you 3 actionable tactics to help you recruit more volunteers in your church. Most churches struggle to get enough volunteers. As your church grows, the need for more volunteers grows too. Yet most churches are failing to leverage the 3 most predictive actions for recruiting more volunteers. In this week's episode, we walk you through the 3 tactics your church can begin applying immediately to start recruiting more volunteers in your church. To read today's show notes and to access the freebies mentioned in today's episode, visit malphursgroup.com/16. That's the number 16. If you like today's episode, please subscribe and share with your friends in ministry. Now, let's dive in.
Okay, this week we are talking about getting people serving in the church in greater numbers, greater frequency. We call this mobilization is our term for this. But Scott, you got a great article this week simply entitled Getting People from Sitting to Serving. So making that shift from spectator to participant.
Yeah. Have you ever met the church, AJ, that has had too many volunteers?
I don't recall anybody, filling out a contact form saying, please help me with all these volunteers. No.
I do not have enough places for them to volunteer and serve in. No, most of the churches we talk to, they're struggling to get enough volunteers, especially in places like children's ministry or student ministry, or, they don't have enough greeters or whatever like it, or they've got people who are serving in 5 different ministries. So they've got all their bases covered, but they're burning out volunteers because the same folks are serving in lots of places.
Yeah, we've talked about this on previous episodes about people burning out because they've been overworked in a position. And the church can fall victim to this of saying, we are fully staffed, we're fully volunteer staffed. But are you really probably fully volunteer staffed is double the positions, at least double the positions that need to be filled. And most churches probably aren't there, so that you're not able to have, A team, B team, alternating Sundays, all that stuff. So you probably, like every other church, do not have enough volunteers. And this literally I had a call yesterday with a church leader, and this was one of the primary issues that they're struggling with is getting people serving in the church because people make ministries happen. That's one of the primary resources that we need in the church is volunteers and later on staff. So this is a great topic.
Yes, what's interesting is, I feel like in the last several episodes, I keep mentioning the leadership pipeline design process, but here I am mentioning it again. One of the things that we do in that process is we have leaders come with like a list of all their volunteer positions and all the different opportunities for serving in the church. That's kind of a piece of data that we need. Inevitably, what comes up is churches don't know. They genuinely don't know who is double and triple and quadruple dipping. Like they're not even aware of the volunteers they have that are serving in, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different. They maybe know a couple people, but they have no clue. And so we kind of shine a spotlight on that challenge in that process. But that's not what we're talking about today. The reality is that most churches don't know how to develop more and better leaders in their churches. And so we want to help today. We want to give you some really specific 3 really specific tactics that you can use to increase the number of volunteers in your church.
Yeah, I like the outline that you've given us here today, Scott. So as you mentioned, there's 3 tactics. The first one you've entitled or just kind of labeled as ask earlier. So, and I guess your point here is that we maybe wait too long to try to get people engaged.
Yeah, we wait too long. However early you are asking folks to start volunteering, it's not early enough. I can almost assure you. I can remember specifically a church that I worked with earlier this year, and they kind of wore it almost as a badge of honor that one of the things they would say to folks when they would come and visit the church is, hey, we're not going to ask you to do anything for a year. They said, our church is a healing place. A lot of people who come to our church have been to church other places and have been really hurt. And so we want them to give them an opportunity to heal up. And so that's a really good sentiment. But there's some things behind that, AJ, that I think you're unintentionally saying. One unintentional thing that you're saying when you say, hey, we want to give you a year to heal up, is that if you were to start serving in your church, that you would be at risk of us hurting you, right? Like you're kind of saying, hey, yeah, the best way to protect yourself is to actually keep us at arm's distance, which is probably not what you want to say, but it's kind of what you're saying. The other thing that you're unintentionally saying, AJ, is that the best way to heal up is to be less involved.
Yeah. No.
Right? Like the best way for you to heal is to do nothing or just to kind of sit in the back row. And that might be good for a minute to catch your breath. And certainly if you're in a really wounded place spiritually, probably we are not going to put you in charge of a ministry or put you on staff or have you run something. But the recipe in scripture for us to heal up is to be involved. Like that's the call on us, is to use the gifts that God has given us to serve the body. And so don't do that. Don't say, hey, come here for a year. Because what you're doing is you're building a habit of sitting. And it's really hard for folks to overcome that inertia.
Right. Yeah, we get some physics implications here.
Absolutely. 100%. And so if you're not asking folks for a whole year to do anything, don't expect them to be jumping up to volunteer a year in. So ask earlier. Oftentimes those folks are your most enthusiastic folks anyway. They like what your church is about. They maybe have been coming for a month or 2 months or 3 months or whatever until they've kind of feel like, yeah, I want to make this place my church home. Before you even ask them to become a member, you can ask them to volunteer. Off air, AJ, I was telling you about a church that I'm aware of. So I'll say their name. They're killing it. Community Christian Church in White Marsh, Maryland. Their process is once you are new to the church, you'll attend a newcomer event, something really low commitment, like a pizza with the pastor type thing, right after church on a Sunday. And they'll ask you in that meeting to sign up to be a greeter. They put everybody as a greeter first before they put them in any other ministry. They have them serve as a greeter for a season. And they'll ask them straight out the gate to become a greeter at their church. And they have something like an 80% engagement rate in service, AJ, from their regular attenders, which is nutso. Yeah. And so that's how early I'm talking about. You get them to come to some sort of a newcomer event, and then you're immediately asking them to engage in service. So however early you're asking, it's probably not early enough.
We don't do that with any other aspect of Christian faith or Christian maturity. We don't say, you know what, wait a year before you start giving.
Or reading the Bible.
Yeah, right. Don't start sharing your faith until you maybe, wait a year, make sure that you're really settled in, you understand what's going on, and then tell people about Jesus. So nowhere else in the church are we pausing. We're talking about life transformation when we become believers. Being generous with all the resources that God has entrusted us with is what we should be generous with. And that includes our time, our service to the world and to the body of Christ. So yeah, that's a great one.
Be tactful with that, right? You don't have to hustle folks when they're coming in and be like, all right, start serving. But, in an emotionally intelligent way, engage people and invite them to serve earlier than you are right now. That'd be tactic number one.
That's great. I love it. All right. Tactic number 2, you've got down to ask specifically. And so what you get into here is that we have a design by God to do things for the church and for the world. And so talk to us about a specific ask depending on the person.
Yeah. So you might, take what they're doing there at Community Christian and have folks, everybody starts as a greeter, but you've got more volunteer opportunities than that. And so sustainably, you would want to invite people to serve in an area of their giftedness. So churches generally don't do this. Most of the time, they'll do a very general call to action. So they'll say things like, hey, we'd love to have you volunteer. Here's a list of all the opportunities. And you kind of leave it up to them to figure out what their giftedness is and where they might want to serve. Or sometimes churches they'll ask specifically, but just around an urgent need, right? So we need nursery help. Anybody who wants to serve in nursery, please sign up to help with nursery. We need people to rock babies. And so they'll ask specifically that way. But that's not what I'm talking about. A better way is to ask people to serve in an area that aligns with their giftedness, which means you have to do the work to help them find out what their giftedness is. A lot of churches right now are using Growth Track, put out by the Church of the Highlands folks there. And it's a great model. It has that process built in to help folks find their giftedness, but you don't have to use that. You can create your own sort of process. But if you're looking at something that's more done for you that you can adapt, check out the Growth Track. Just Google Growth Track download. It's free. You can download that curriculum and adapt it yourself. And then you get to pick your own assessments. Like Shape is still really good from the old Shape system from Saddleback. We really like it. It's still a good choice, but you can also keep it pretty simple. So here's my personal recommendation. I think you should do 2 assessments, AJ. I like the DISC and I like a spiritual gifts inventory. DISC is a temperament assessment for those of you who are not familiar with it. DISC, DISC. And I like it because it's just 4 things. So the Enneagram, for example, is really popular. It's in vogue right now. But the challenge with the Enneagram is that it's, I think, 9 different types. And so if you were to categorize all of your volunteer positions by the 9 different Enneagram types, and then you throw in the wings and all that, I mean, it's just too complex. So DISC is really simple. It's just 4 types, and it's very easy to chunk your volunteer opportunities into those 4 buckets. So I like DISC. Spiritual gifts, recommend doing an inventory that's really simple. Whatever your tradition is, you might have more or less things listed on a spiritual gifts inventory. But we've got PDF versions actually, AJ, of both the DISC and the spiritual gifts inventory that are both very simple, quick, easy assessments to do. And folks can download those from the show notes today. malfersgroup.com/16.
There you go. Number 16.
Yeah. So here's what you do. You get folks to take a couple of assessments. I'm recommending DISC and a spiritual gifts inventory, but you can choose whatever you want. And you want to categorize all of your volunteer opportunities by those assessments. So start with DISC, then also you can add spiritual gifts. So let's take an example.
Yeah, so let me make sure this is clear, because this is some pre-work to do before you get to tactic number 2 of asking specifically.
That's true.
This is first understanding all the ministries of your church, having a ministry inventory and an audit or an inventory of all of your volunteer position needs or all of your staffing needs, volunteer or otherwise.
Right. Yep. You're going to have to sit down and sort them all.
Mm-hmm. With job descriptions, and what you're leading up to is sort of what's a general idea of an ideal candidate for these positions.
Correct. So keep those job descriptions really short. Brief description of what the job responsibilities are, and then you might want to also include on there like a time commitment. So how much time are they needing to invest in it in that position? And then what we call divine design alignment. So, what DISC temperament or temperaments are best for that position, and which spiritual gift or spiritual gifts best work for that position. So let's take a specific example, AJ, so maybe people can understand. Let's say we're using Growth Track and we put people, or some other membership class, and we put people through the DISC and the spiritual gifts inventory, okay? And a person who scores as an introvert who is really task-oriented. That's what a C-type is. C-type folks they don't like people and they like to get stuff done. Just being frank, they're not people at all. And let's say they have the spiritual gift of administration, which would really dovetail in well with the C. They might be a great fit to volunteer during the week doing data entry from your Connect cards. So that's a real important ministry. You have people fill out Connect cards and you want to be able to communicate and follow up with them really well. Have your C-type folks who have the gift of administration be the ones that come in on Monday morning and enter all those into your, church management software. That'd be a great volunteer opportunity. If you've got someone who is a D and they have the gift of teaching, you might put them in as a small group leader. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're connecting them with an opportunity that aligns with their giftedness and ask them that way.
Right.
That's what we mean by asking specifically. Ask them specifically according to their giftedness.
Yeah, the sustainability of the ministry and the long-term benefit really just can't be overstated, because when people are serving in their gifting, and really getting to express themselves and express their, in ministry and how God made them, that's where you find longevity in ministry. That's where you find passion. And, that comes through because you've all met the person that's really serving where they should be serving, and everybody loves them and they're great at it. And then you've met the people that, they're just kind of doing it because they needed a warm body. And there's a difference there. And, the latter is unsustainable and the former really can drive your ministry ahead in reaching your mission, vision, goals. So this really, and few churches take the time to do this. In my experience, I think it takes a while for them to grasp the importance of this, to really take the time, because this is a lot of front end work to inventory your ministries, inventory your positions, write job descriptions. It takes work. We're not saying this is, one weekend and the project is ready to roll out, but it's so worth it now and in the future.
Actually, what I found too, AJ, is that churches actually do this, but they do it like once.
Yeah, never update it. Sure.
Or they'll do a series on spiritual gifts, put people through a spiritual gifts inventory, encourage them to find something that's in alignment with their gifts. And they do that one time versus creating a system of doing it regularly. And so that's a challenge. But honestly, the more that churches have switched to Growth Track kind of makes them do that. So it's been a good shift for churches. I got to give props to those guys for creating something that's really working. So again, you might not be on the same theological bandwagon that those folks are on, and that's fine. But I know for a fact that you can download that curriculum, and it's a Word document, so you can edit it. And anything that you don't like that doesn't align with you, you take the spirit of the structure of Growth Track and adapt it for the culture of your church and your own sort of theological convictions.
Yeah. So in that respect, our first tactic of asking early fits in nicely with our second tactic of asking specifically. And if you have a process for new people to your church to go through initially, then you can accomplish both of these things, asking them very early in their relationship with you and asking them in a specific way to volunteer or to help out in a very specific ministry that will be a great fit for them. So
yeah, but on that note, that's assuming that you're pushing people towards a growth track pretty quick. And a lot of churches aren't. They let people kind of sit there for a long time before they ever ask them to. I mean, your push at some point needs to be like, if that's the finish line you want them to go across in your sort of engagement process or assimilation process, then you need to be doing the push from the first time that they're on site at your church to get them into that growth track. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to grease the wheels all the way through? Which is a topic for another day. But yeah, trying to get them across that finish line, so to speak, that best next step as early on as possible.
All right, 2 great tactics to start, and the third one coming up now. So you've kind of titled this one "Sharing Stories," and I love this. I just find so much, I don't know, I just get excited whenever I'm hearing about things going on in my church, and the things that people are doing and the differences that they're making. So talk to us about sharing stories, because I'm just sold out on this as being a great tactic.
Yeah. So the asking, it's ask, share, sort of in the, ask early, ask specifically, share. You can't be all call to action all the time. You can't. You got to give some context and environment for those calls to action to live. And that environment is story, sharing what's happening. If people don't feel like they're contributing to something important when they serve, they're going to burn out and they're going to eventually quit. So there's 2 ways to share stories, and both are really important. The first is to share stories one-on-one and just show appreciation. So, you see Sally, you're doing awesome. That kid that you had in class last year is getting baptized next weekend. You might not have known that. And you played a role in that kid's faith story, in their faith journey. Like, tell them that story of something that happened that they might not immediately see. And it might not even be that big of a win. It might be something small, like see Jim's a greeter. Jim, you've got a killer smile. I'm so glad that you are on the greeter team. I don't think you know the difference you're making. I'm watching all these people come flooding into the building, and they've just seen you and they've got a smile on their face. Your smile is so contagious. Share the story of the difference that Jim and Sally are making on an individual level. That's really important. But also you need to share those stories towards the whole church. In a sense, AJ, you want to make people jealous. Like, share
Yeah.
the amazing things that God is doing through your volunteer teams with the whole church. And when people hear these stories, they want to experience that themselves. You won't have to beg them to serve, because everybody wants to be a part of a winning team. If you show how your volunteers are winning by volunteering, they'll want to be a part. I really promise. When you combine sharing those stories with tactic 1 and tactic 2, it's a recipe for success.
I think this is one of those opportunities to kind of tee up, if you will, a Holy Spirit moment. I think these are, whenever you see, from your pulpit, stage, platform, whatever is happening at the front of your church, the talking head up there is sharing stories like this. These are the opportunities that the Holy Spirit uses to prick somebody's heart and put that smile on their face, or they're like, wow, I want to know more about that, or that really seems like something I would like to do. So you could tee that up every Sunday and probably be finding people that want to say, you know what, that sounds awesome. I want to be a part of that.
Yeah. I mentioned off air, AJ, that our church has a really challenging parking lot situation. Just the way that the building's positioned, there's one entrance in, one entrance out. There's not a way to change that. It's just a challenge. And we've got 3 services. And so managing those transitions and services is a nightmare. But we've got a great parking team that makes the most of a difficult situation. They really do. And, our church does a great job celebrating the work that they're doing. And I got to be honest, I have a different perspective on them when I see them as I'm driving in. I'm more appreciative of them. Kind of want to be a part of that. You want to be a part of, they're making a difference, making a really challenging situation less challenging. And so it makes it easier to get a yes when you ask them to serve. If you're weaving this tapestry of story of how God is using these volunteer teams to do amazing things. Lots of times our volunteer teams are out of sight, out of mind. They just kind of filter into the background noise. That children's ministry somehow just happens, that children's check-in just happens, that the parking thing just happens, that the coffee magically shows up when you show up. And none of that is true. It all happens with volunteers. And so when you can highlight their stories and the amazing things that are happening through their sacrificial service, people want to join in and be a part of that when you ask them.
These are some great tactics, Scott, that I think can really be helpful in increasing the mobilization factor of our congregations so that people are being involved in ministry. So let's recap. Tactic number 1 was to ask early. Don't delay. Get people involved as soon as you can. Tactic number 2 is to ask specifically, and that's having a culture and a system in place so that people can find out how God has designed them and where they can serve that would be the best fit. And then finally sharing these stories with your volunteer team and with your church so that people can see what's happening and want to be a part of it.
So these 3 tactics, we really hope that they help you increase the number of volunteers in your church. Listen, there's a lot of moving parts to recruiting volunteers. We get it. But if you can start with these 3 things, asking earlier, asking more specifically, and sharing stories in your church, if you can do those 3 things, it's a great place to start. Thanks so much for listening to episode 16 of the Church Revitalization podcast. If you want to get today's show notes and the whole article that I've written and those 2 assessments that we're including, those 2 PDFs, the DISC and the Spiritual Gifts Inventory, go to malfersgroup.com/16. Thanks so much for listening, for subscribing, for sharing this with your friends in ministry, and we'll talk with you next time.